Hello, welcome back. Welcome back to another ASMR reading session where we will be continuing to read the Arabian Nights Entertainments. Before we continue with the story, I'm going to do some little ASMR noises using some of the tools that I have prepared today while we are waiting for more people to join and listen to the story. Hello, welcome to another ASMR reading session. I will begin reading the story in around 3 or 4 minutes. So while we are waiting, I will be making some ASMR noises with the tools that I have prepared. I am looking forward to continue with the story. Last time we left off somewhere in the middle of the story of the fisherman, where the king or the sultan discovered a hidden palace with a sad young king whose bottom half was made of black marble. And today we shall continue with the story by listening to how the young king became what he is today. I plan to stream for around 2 hours, and 1 hour into the stream, which is also halfway into the stream, I will be doing a little intermission where I make some ASMR noises without any book reading, in order to rest my throat and also to, I guess, let you guys take a little break from reading 1 hour's worth of stories. Thank you, Gestilence. I'm glad it sounds good. This is okay. It's 2:05, so I'm gonna put down my ASMR tool and continue with the story. The story of the young king of the Black Isles. You must know, sire, that my father was Mahmud, the king of this country, the Black Isles, so called from the 4 little mountains which were once islands, while the capital was the place where now the great lake lies. My story will tell you how these changes came about. My father died when he was 66, and I succeeded him. I married my cousin, whom I loved tenderly, and I thought she loved me too. But one afternoon, when I was half asleep and was being fanned by 2 of her maids, I heard one say to the other, "What a pity it is that our mistress no longer loves our master. I believe she would like to kill him if she could, for she is an enchantress." I soon found by watching that they were right, and when I mortally wounded a favourite slave of hers for a great crime, she begged that she might build a palace in the garden, where she wept and bewailed him for 2 years. At last I begged her to cease grieving for him, for although he could not speak or move, by her enchantments she just kept him alive. She turned upon me in a rage and set over me some magic words, and I instantly became, as you see me now, half man and half marble. Then this wicked enchantress changed the capital, which was a very populous and flourishing city, into the lake and desert plain you saw. The fish of 4 colours which are in it are the different races who lived in the town. The 4 hills are the 4 islands which give the name to my kingdom. All this the enchantress told me to add to my troubles. And this is not all. Every day she comes and beats me with a whip of buffalo hide. When the young king had finished his sad story, he burst once more into tears, and the Sultan was much moved. "Tell me," he cried, "where is this wicked woman, and where is the miserable object of her affection, whom she just manages to keep alive?" "Where she lives I do not know," answered the unhappy prince, "but she goes every day at sunrise to see if the slave can yet speak to her after she has beaten me." "Unfortunate king," said the Sultan, "I will do what I can to avenge you." So he consulted with the young king over the best way to bring this about, and they agreed their plan should be to put in effect the next day. The Sultan then rested, and the young king gave himself up to happy hopes of release. The next day the Sultan arose and then went to the palace in the garden where the black slave was. He drew his sword and destroyed the little life that was remained in him, and then threw the body down a well. He then lay down on the couch where the slave had been, and waited for the enchantress. She went first to the young king, whom she beat with 100 blows. Then she came to the room where she thought her wounded slave was, but where the Sultan really lay. She came near his couch and said, "Are you better today, my slave? Speak but one word to me." "How can I be better," answered the Sultan, imitating the language of the Ethiopians, "when I can never sleep for the cries and groans of your husband?" "What joy to hear you speak," answered the queen. "Do you wish him to regain his proper shape?" "Yes," said the Sultan, Hasten to set him at liberty, so that I may no longer hear his cries." The queen at once went out and took a cup of water, and said over it some words that made it boil as if it were on the fire. Then she threw it over the prince, who at once regained his own form. He was filled with joy, but the enchantress said, "Hasten away from this place and never come back, lest I kill you." So he hid himself to see the end of the Sultan's plan. The enchantress went back to the Palace of Tears and said, "Now I have done what you wished." "What you have done," said the Sultan, "is not enough to cure me. Every day at midnight, all the people whom you have changed into fish lift their heads out of the lake and cry for vengeance. Go quickly and give them their proper shape." The enchantress hurried away and said some words over the lake. The fish then became men, women and children, and the houses and shops were once more filled. The Sultan's suite, who had encamped by the lake, were not a little astonished to see themselves in the middle of a large and beautiful town. As soon as she had disenchanted it, the queen went back to the palace. "Are you quite well now?" she said. "Come near," said the Sultan, "nearer still." She obeyed. Then he sprang up, and with one blow of his sword he cut her in two. Then he went and found the prince. "Rejoice," he said, "your cruel enemy is dead." The prince thanked him again and again. "And now," said the Sultan, "I will go back to my capital, which I am glad to find is so near yours." "So near mine," said the King of the Black Isles. "Do you know it is a whole year's journey from here? You came here in a few hours because it was enchanted, but I will accompany you on your journey." "It will give me much pleasure if you will escort me," said the Sultan. "As I have no children, I will make you my heir." The Sultan and the prince set out together, the Sultan laden with rich presents from the King of the Black Isles. The day after he reached the capital, the Sultan assembled his court and told them all that had befallen him, and told them how he intended to adopt the young king as his heir. Then he gave each man presents in proportion to his rank. As for the fisherman, as he was the first cause of the deliverance of the young prince, the Sultan gave him much money, and made him and his family happy for the rest of their days. Well, I believe this wraps up the story of the fisherman. Quite a nice tale, if you ask me. I'm going to drink some water. I've been searching through my home for objects that might sound good to the ear, and I have procured among one of my items a comb. Hello, Florida man, how are you doing today? We have just finished reading the story of the fisherman. We finished the whole story. he got a happy ending, which is nice. Here's the comb that I got today. Sorry, I'm a little bit clumsy still, but I am trying my best. You just finished your book report. That's nice. Book reports have always been a pain to me back in the day when I had to do them as well. What is your book report about, if you don't mind me asking? I still remember that phase when I read a lot of fantasy stories, fantasy novels and novellas and short stories. And then one day I picked up a popular science book, and then I just continued reading popular science from then on. I have no mouth yet I must scream. That's a famous book, isn't it? I have heard of it, although I don't quite know what it is about. Sci-fi horror. Oh, okay. Okay. I think we can move on to the next story. The story of the 3 calenders, sons of kings, and of 5 ladies of Baghdad. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived at Baghdad a porter who, in spite of his humble calling, was an intelligent and sensible man. One morning he was sitting in his usual place with his basket before him, waiting to be hired, when a tall young lady, covered with a long muslin veil, came up to him and said, "Pick up your basket and follow me." The porter, who was greatly pleased by her appearance and voice, jumped up at once, poised his basket on his head, and accompanied the lady, saying to himself as he went, "Oh, happy day, a lucky meeting." The lady soon stopped before a closed door, at which she knocked. It was opened by an old man with long white beard, to whom the lady held out money without speaking. The old man, who seemed to understand what she wanted, vanished into the house, and returned bringing a large jar of wine, which the porter placed in his basket. Then the lady signed to him to follow, and they went their way. The next place she stopped at was a fruit and flower shop, and here she bought a large quantity of apples, apricots, peaches, and other things, with lilies, jasmine, and all sorts of sweet-smelling plants. From this shop she went to a butcher's, a grocer's, and a poulterer's, till at last the porter exclaimed in despair, "My good lady, if you had only told me you were going to buy enough provisions to stock a town, I would have brought a horse, or rather a camel." The lady laughed and told him she had not finished yet, but after choosing various kinds of scents and spices from a druggist's store, she halted before a magnificent palace, at the door of which she knocked gently. The portress who opened it was of such beauty that the eyes of the man were quite dazzled, and he was the more astonished as he saw clearly that she was no slave. The lady who had led him hither stood watching him with amusement, till the portress exclaimed, "Why don't you come in, my sister? This poor man is so heavily weighed down that he is ready to drop." When they were both inside, the door was fastened, and they all three entered a large court, surrounded by an open-work gallery. At one end of the court was a platform, and on the platform stood an amber throne supported by 4 ebony columns, garnished with pearls and diamonds. In the middle of the court stood a marble basin filled with water from the mouth of a golden lion. The porter looked about him, noticing and admiring everything, but his attention was especially attracted by a third lady sitting on the throne, who was even more beautiful than the other 2. By the respect shown to her by the others, he judged that she must be the eldest, and in this he was right. This lady's name was Zobeida, the portress was Sadie, and the housekeeper was Amina. At a word from Zobeida, Sadie and Amina took the basket from the porter, who was glad enough to be relieved from its weight, and when it was emptied, paid him handsomely for its use. But instead of taking up his basket and going away, the man still lingered, till Zobeida inquired what he was waiting for, and if he expected more money. "Oh, madam," returned he, "you have already given me too much, and I fear I may have been guilty of rudeness in not taking my departure at once. But, if you will pardon me saying so, I was lost in astonishment at seeing such beautiful ladies by themselves. A company of women without men is, however, as dull as a company of men without women." And after telling some stories to prove his point, he ended by entreating them to let him stay and make a fourth at their dinner. The ladies were rather amused at the man's assurances, and, after some discussion, it was agreed that he should be allowed to stay, as his society might prove entertaining. "But listen, friend," said Zobeida. "If we grant your request, it is only on condition that you behave with the utmost politeness, and that you keep the secret of our way of living, which chance has been revealed to you." Then they all sat down to table, which had been covered by Amina with the dishes she had bought. After the first few mouthfuls, Amina poured some wine into a golden cup. She first drank herself, according to the Arab custom, and then filled it for her sisters. When it came to the porter's turn, he kissed Amina's hand and sang a song, which he composed at the moment in praise of the wine. The three ladies were pleased with the song, and then sang themselves, so that the repast was a merry one, and lasted much longer than usual. At length, seeing that the sun was about to set, Sadia said to the porter, "Rise and go. It is now time for us to separate." "Oh, madam," replied he, "how can you desire me to quit you in the state in which I am? Between the wine I have drunk and the pleasure of seeing you, I should never find the way to my house. Let me remain here till morning, and when I have recovered my senses, I will go when you like." "Let him stay," said Amina, who had before proved herself his friend. "It is only just, as he has given us so much amusement." "If you wish it, my sister," replied Zubaydah. "But if he does, I must make a new condition, porter," she continued, turning to him. "If you remain, you must promise to ask no questions about anything you may see. If you do, you may perhaps hear what you don't like." This being settled, Amina brought in supper, and lit up the hall with a number of sweet-smelling tapers. They then sat down again at the table, and began with fresh appetites to eat, drink, sing, and recite verses. In fact, they were all enjoying themselves mightily when they heard a knock at the outer door, which Sadie rose to open. She soon returned, saying that 3 calenders, all blind in the right eye, and all with their heads, faces, and eyebrows clean-shaved, begged for admittance, as they were newly arrived in Bagdad, and night had already fallen. "They seem to have pleasant manners," she added, "but you have no idea how funny they look. I'm sure we should find their company diverting." Zubaydah and Amina made some difficulty about admitting the newcomers, and Sadie knew the reason of their hesitation, but she urged the matter so strongly that Zubaydah was at last forced to consent. "Bring them in, then," said she, "but make them understand that they are not to make remarks about what does not concern them, and be sure to make them read the inscription over the door." For on the door was written in letters of gold, "Whoso meddles in affairs that are of no business of his will hear truths that will not please him." The 3 calenders bowed low on entering, and thanked the ladies for their kindness and hospitality. The ladies replied with words of welcome, and they were all about to seat themselves when the eyes of the calenders fell on the porter, whose dress was not so very unlike their own, though he still wore all the hair that nature had given him. "This," said one of them, "is apparently one of our Arab brothers, who has rebelled against our ruler." The porter, although half asleep from the wine he had drunk, heard the words, and, without moving, cried angrily to the calender, "Sit down and mind your own business. Did you not read the inscription over the door? Everybody is not obliged to live in the same way." "Do not be so angry, my good man," replied the calender. "We should be very sorry to displease you." So the quarrel was smoothed over, and supper began in good earnest. When the calenders had satisfied their hunger, they offered to play to their hostesses, if there were any instruments in the house. The ladies were delighted at the idea, and Sadie went to see what she could find, returning in a few moments laden with 2 different kinds of flutes and a tambourine. Each calender took the one he preferred and began to play a well-known air, while the ladies sang the words of the song. These words were the gayest and liveliest possible, and every now and then the singers had to stop to indulge the laughter which almost choked them. In the midst of all their noise, a knock was heard at the door. Now, early that evening, the Caliph secretly left the palace, accompanied by his Grand Vizier Giafar and Mesrour, chief of the eunuchs, all 3 wearing the dresses of merchants. Passing down the street, the Caliph had been attracted by the music of instruments and the sound of laughter, and had ordered his vizier to go and knock at the door of the house, as he wished to enter. The vizier replied that the ladies who lived there seemed to be entertaining their friends, and he thought his master would do well not to intrude on them. But the Caliph had taken it into his head to see for himself, and insisted on being obeyed. The knock was answered by Sadie, with a taper in her hand, and the vizier, who was surprised at her beauty, bowed low before her and said respectfully, "Madam, we are 3 merchants who have lately arrived from Mosul, and, owing to a misadventure which befell us this very night, only reached our inn to find that the doors were closed to us till tomorrow morning. Not knowing what to do, we wandered in the streets till we happened to pass your house, when, seeing lights and hearing the sound of voices, we resolved to ask you to give us shelter till the dawn. If you grant us this favour, we will, with your permission, do all in our power to help you spend the time pleasantly." Sadie answered the merchant that she must first consult her sisters, and after having talked over the matter with them, she returned to tell him that he and his 2 friends would be welcome to join their company. They entered and bowed politely to the ladies and their guests. Then Zubaydah, as the mistress, came forward and said gravely, "You are welcome here, but I hope you will allow me to beg one thing of you. Have as many eyes as you like, but no tongues, and ask no questions about anything you see, however strange it may appear to you." "Madam," returned the vizier, "you shall be obeyed. We have quite enough to please and interest us, without troubling ourselves about that with which we have no concern." Then they all sat down and drank to the health of the newcomers. While the vizier Giafar was talking to the ladies, the Caliph was occupied in wondering who they could be, and why the 3 calenders had each lost his right eye. He was burning to inquire the reason of it all, but was silenced by Zubaydah's request. So he tried to rouse himself and to take his part in the conversation, which was very lively, the subject of discussion being the many different sorts of pleasures that there were in the world. After some time, the calenders got up and performed some curious dances, which delighted the rest of the company. When they had finished, Zubaydah rose from her seat, and, taking Amina by the hand, she said to her, "My sister, our friends will excuse us if we seem to forget their presence and fulfill our nightly task." Amina understood her sister's meaning, and collecting the dishes, glasses, and musical instruments, she carried them away, while Sadie swept the hall and put everything in order. Having done this, she begged the Calenders to sit on a sofa on one side of the room, and the Caliph and his friends to place themselves opposite. As to the porter, she requested him to come and help her and her sister. Shortly after, Amina entered carrying a seat, which she put down in the middle of the empty space. She then went over to the door of a closet and signed to the porter to follow her. He did so, and soon reappeared leading 2 black dogs by a chain, which he brought into the centre of the hall. Zubaydah then got up from her seat between the Calenders and the Caliph, and walked slowly across to where the porter stood with the dogs. "We must do our duty," she said with a deep sigh, pushing back her sleeves, and, taking a whip from Sadie, she said to the man, "Take one of those dogs to my sister Amina, and give me the other." The porter did as he was bid, but as he led the dog to Zubaydah, it uttered piercing howls and gazed up at her with looks of entreaty. But Zubaydah took no notice and whipped the dog till she was out of breath. She then took the chain from the porter and, raising the dog on its hind legs, they looked into each other's eyes sorrowfully till tears began to fall from both. Then Zubaydah took her handkerchief and wiped the dog's eyes tenderly, after which she kissed it. Then, putting the chain into the porter's hand, she said, "Take it back to the closet and bring me the other." The same ceremony was gone through with the second dog, and all the while the whole company looked on with astonishment. The Caliph in particular could hardly contain himself, and made signs to the Vizier to ask what it all meant. But the Vizier pretended not to see, and turned his head away. Zubaydah remained for some time in the middle of the room, till at last Sadie went up to her and begged her to sit down, as she also had her part to play. At these words, Amina fetched a lute from a case of yellow satin and gave it to Sadie, who sang several songs to its accompaniment. When she was tired, she said to Amina, "My sister, I can do no more. Come, I pray you, and take my place." Amina struck a few chords and then broke into a song, which she sang with so much ardour that she was quite overcome, and sank gasping on a pile of cushions, tearing open her dress as she did to give herself some air. To the amazement of all present, her neck, instead of being as smooth and white as her face, was a mass of scars. The Calenders and the Caliph looked at each other, and whispered together, unheard by Zubaydah and Sadie, who were tending to their fainting sister. "What does this all mean?" asked the Caliph. "We know no more than you," said the Calender to whom he had spoken. "What? You do not belong to the house?" "My lord," answered all the Calenders together, "we came here for the first time an hour before you." They then turned to the porter to see if he could explain the mystery, but the porter was no wiser than they were themselves. At length the Caliph could contain his curiosity no longer, and declared that he would compel the ladies to tell them the meaning of their strange conduct. The Vizier, foreseeing what would happen, implored him to remember the condition their hostesses had imposed, and added in a whisper that if His Highness would only wait till morning, he could, as Caliph, summon the ladies to appear before him. But the Caliph, who was not accustomed to be contradicted, rejected this advice, and it was resolved, after a little more talking, that the question should be put by the porter. Suddenly Zubaydah turned around, and, seeing their excitement, she said, "What is the matter? What are you all discussing so earnestly?" "Madam," answered the porter, "these gentlemen entreat you to explain to them why you should first whip the dogs and then cry over them, and also how it happens that the fainting lady is covered with scars. They have requested me, madam, to be their mouthpiece." "Is it true, gentlemen," asked Zubaydah, drawing herself up, "that you have charged this man to put me that question?" "It is," they all replied, except Giafar, who was silent. "Is this," continued Zubaydah, growing more angry every moment, "is this the return you make for the hospitality I have shown you? Have you forgotten the one condition on which you were allowed to enter the house? Come quickly," she added, clapping her hands 3 times, and the words were hardly uttered when 7 black slaves, each armed with a sabre, burst in and stood over the 7 men, throwing them on the ground, and preparing themselves, on a sign from their mistress, to cut off their heads. The 7 culprits all thought their last hour had come, and the Caliph repented bitterly that he had not taken the vizier's advice. But they made up their minds to die bravely, all except the porter, who loudly inquired of Zubaydah why he was to suffer for other people's faults, and declared that these misfortunes would never have happened if it had not been for the Calenders, who always brought ill luck. He ended by imploring Zubaydah not to confound the innocent with the guilty, and to spare his life. In spite of her anger, there was something so comic in the groans of the porter that Zubaydah could not refrain from laughing. But putting him aside, she addressed the others a second time, saying, "Answer me, who are you? Unless you tell me truly, you have not another moment to live. I can hardly think you are men of any position, whatever country you belong to. If you were, you would have had more consideration for us." The Caliph, who was naturally very impatient, suffered far more than either of the others at feeling that his life was at the mercy of a justly offended lady, but when he heard her question, he began to breathe more freely, for he was convinced that she had only to learn his name and rank for all the danger to be over. So he whispered hastily to the vizier, who was next to him, to reveal their secret. But the vizier, wiser than his master, wished to conceal from the public the affront they had received, and merely answered, "After all, we have only got what we deserved." Meanwhile, Zubaydah had turned to the 3 Calenders and inquired if, as they were all blind, they were brothers. "No, madam," replied one, "we are no blood relations at all, only brothers by our mode of life." "And you," she asked, addressing another, "were you born blind of one eye?" "No, madam," returned he, "I became blind through a most surprising adventure, such as probably has never happened to anybody. After that, I shaved my head and eyebrows and put on the dress in which you see me now." Zubaydah put the same question to the other 2 Calenders, and received the same answer, But, added the third, it may interest you, madam, to know that we are not men of low birth, but are all three sons of kings, and of kings too, whom the world holds in high esteem. At these words, Zobeida's anger cooled down, and she turned to her slaves and said, "You can give them a little more liberty, but do not leave the hall. Those that will tell us their histories and their reasons for coming here shall be allowed to leave unhurt. Those who refuse," as she paused, but in a moment of Porter, who understood that he had only to relate his story to set himself free from this terrible danger, immediately broke in. "Madam, you know already how I came here, and what I have to say will soon be told. Your sister found me this morning in the place where I always stand waiting to be hired. She bade me follow her to various shops, and when my basket was quite full, we returned to this house, when you had the goodness to permit me to remain, for which I shall be eternally grateful. That is my story." He looked anxiously to Zobeida, who nodded her head and said, "You can go, and take care we never meet again." "Oh, madam," cried the porter, "let me stay yet a little while. It is not just that the others should have heard my story, and that I should not hear theirs." And without waiting for permission, he seated himself on the end of the sofa occupied by the ladies, whilst the rest crouched on the carpet, and the slaves stood against the wall. Then one of the calenders, addressing himself to Zobeida as the principal lady, began his story. Hello Talvamir, welcome back. I hope you are having a good, cozy time. Imagine asking anything after seeing that whole mess. Yes, I know, right? Thank you for the follow, Smack in Thy Cheeks. Thank you very much. Well, before we move on to the next section of this story, I think we can have a little intermission again, where I make some ASMR noises. Once again, if you have any preferences or triggers or advice about ASMR, please feel free to let me know. getting a little bit stuffy. I think I should re-tie my hair since it is so very stuffy. All right. I suppose we can continue. The story of the first Calender, son of a king. In order, madam, to explain how I came to lose my right eye and to wear the dress of a calender, you must first know that I am the son of a king. My father's only brother reigned over the neighbouring country and had 2 children, a daughter and a son, who were of the same age as myself. As I grew up and was allowed more liberty, I went every year to pay a visit to my uncle's court, and usually stayed there about 2 months. In this way my cousin and I became very intimate and were much attached to each other. The very last time I saw him, he seemed more delighted to see me than ever, and gave a great feast in my honour. When we had finished eating, he said to me, "My cousin, you would never guess what I have been doing since your last visit to us. Directly after your departure, I set a number of men to work on a building after my own design. It is now completed and ready to be lived in. I should like to show it to you, but you must first swear 2 things: to be faithful to me and to keep my secret." Of course, I did not dream of refusing him anything he asked, and gave the promise without the least hesitation. He then bade me wait an instant and vanished, returning in a few moments with a richly dressed lady of great beauty, but as he did not tell me her name, I thought it was better not to inquire. We all 3 sat down to table and amused ourselves with talking of all sorts of indifferent things, and with drinking each other's health. Suddenly the prince said to me, "Cousin, we have no time to lose. Be so kind as to conduct this lady to a certain spot, where you will find a dome-like tomb, newly built. You cannot mistake it. Go in, both of you, and wait till I come. I shall not be long." As I had promised, I prepared to do as I was told, and giving my hand to the lady, I escorted her, by the light of the moon, to the place of which the prince had spoken. We had barely reached it when he joined us himself, carrying a small vessel of water, a pickaxe, and a little bag containing plaster. With the pickaxe he at once began to destroy the empty sepulchre in the middle of the tomb. One by one he took the stones and piled them up in a corner. When he had knocked down the whole sepulchre, he proceeded to dig at the earth, and beneath where the sepulchre had been, I saw a trapdoor. He raised the door, and I caught sight of the top of a spiral staircase. Then he said, turning to the lady, "Madam, is this the way that will lead you down to the spot which I told you of?" The lady did not answer, but silently descended the staircase, the prince following her. At the top, however, he looked at me. "My cousin," he exclaimed, "I do not know how to thank you for your kindness. Farewell." "What do you mean?" I cried. "I do not understand." "No matter," he replied. "Go back by the path that you came." He would say no more, and, greatly puzzled, I returned to my room in the palace and went to bed. When I woke and considered my adventure, I thought that I must have been dreaming, and sent a servant to ask if the prince was dressed and could see me. But on hearing that he had not slept at home, I was much alarmed, and hastened to the cemetery, where, unluckily, the tombs were all so alike that I could not discover which was the one I was in search for, though I spent 4 days in looking for it. You must know that all this time the king, my uncle, was absent on a hunting expedition, and as no one knew when he would be back, I at last decided to return home, leaving the ministers to make my excuses. I longed to tell them what had become of the prince, about whose fate they felt the most dreadful anxiety. But the oath I had sworn kept me silent. On my arrival at my father's capital, I was astonished to find a large detachment of guards drawn up before the gate of the palace. They surrounded me directly I entered. I asked the officers in command the reason of this strange behaviour, and was horrified to learn that the army had mutinied and put to death the king, my father, and had placed the Grand Vizier on the throne. Further, that by his orders I was placed under arrest. Now this rebel vizier had hated me from my boyhood, because once, when shooting at a bird with a bow, I had shot out his eye by accident. Of course, I not only sent a servant at once to offer him my regrets and apologies, but I made them in person. It was all of no use. He cherished an undying hatred towards me, and lost no occasion of showing it. Having once got me in his power, I felt he could show no mercy, and I was right. Mad with triumph and fury, he came to me in my prison and tore out my right eye. That is how I lost it. My persecutor, however, did not stop here. He shut me up in a large case and ordered his executioner to carry me into a desert place, to cut off my head, and then to abandon my body to the birds of prey. The case, with me inside it, was accordingly placed on a horse, and the executioner, accompanied by another man, rode into the country until they found a spot suitable for the purpose. But their hearts were not so hard as they seemed, and my tears and prayers made them waver. "Forsake the kingdom instantly," said the executioner at last, "and take care never to come back, for you will not only lose your head, but make us lose ours." I thanked him gratefully, and tried to console myself for the loss of my eye by thinking of the other misfortunes I had escaped. After all I had gone through, and my fear of being recognized by some enemy, I could only travel very slowly and cautiously, generally resting in some out-of-the-way place by day, and walking as far as I was able by night. But at length I arrived in the kingdom of my uncle, of whose protection I was sure. I found him in great trouble about the disappearance of his son, who had, he said, vanished without leaving a trace. But his own grief did not prevent him from sharing mine. We mingled our tears, for the loss of one was the loss of the other, and then I made up my mind that it was my duty to break the solemn oath I had sworn to the prince. I therefore lost no time in telling my uncle everything I knew, and I observed that even before I had ended his sorrow appeared to be lightened a little. "My dear nephew," he said, "your story gives me some hope. I was aware that my son was building a tomb, and I think I can find the spot. But as he wished to keep the matter secret, let us go alone and seek the place ourselves." He then bade me to disguise myself, and we both slipped out of a garden door which opened on to the cemetery. It did not take long for us to arrive at the scene of the prince's disappearance, or to discover the tomb I had sought so vainly before. We entered it, and found the trapdoor which led to the staircase, but we had great difficulty in raising it, because the prince had fastened it down underneath with the plaster he had brought with him. My uncle went first, and I followed him. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we stepped into a sort of anteroom, filled with such a dense smoke that it was hardly possible to see anything. However, we passed through the smoke into a large chamber, which at first seemed quite empty. The room was brilliantly lighted, and in another moment we perceived a sort of platform at one end, on which were the bodies of the prince and lady, both half burned, as if they had been dragged out of a fire before it had quite consumed them. This horrible sight turned me faint, but, to my surprise, my uncle did not show much surprise as anger. "I knew," he said, "that my son was tenderly attached to this lady, whom it was impossible he should ever marry. I tried to turn his thoughts, and presented to him the most beautiful princesses, but he cared for none of them, and, as you see, they have now been united by a horrible death in an underground tomb." But as he spoke, his anger melted into tears, and again I wept with him. When he recovered himself, he drew me to him. "My dear nephew," he said, embracing me, "you have come to me to take his place, and I will do my best to forget that I ever had a son who could act in so wicked a manner." Then he turned and went up the stairs. We reached the palace without anyone having noticed our absence, when, shortly after, a clashing of drums and cymbals and the blare of trumpets burst upon our astonished ears. At the same time, a thick cloud of dust on the horizon told of the approach of a great army. My heart sank when I perceived that the commander was the vizier who had dethroned my father, and was come to seize the kingdom of my uncle. The capital was so utterly unprepared to stand a siege, and, seeing that resistance was useless, at once opened its gates. My uncle fought hard for his life, but was soon overpowered, and when he fell, I managed to escape through a secret passage and took refuge with an officer whom I knew I could trust. Persecuted by ill fortune and stricken with grief, there seemed to be only one means of safety left to me. I shaved my beard and my eyebrows, and put on the dress of a calender, in which it was easy for me to travel without being known. I avoided the towns till I reached the kingdom of the famous and powerful Caliph Harun al-Rashid, when I had no further reason to fear my enemies. It was my intention to come to Baghdad and to throw myself at the feet of His Highness, who would, I felt certain, be touched by my sad story, and would grant me besides his help and protection. After a journey which lasted some months, I arrived at length at the gates of this city. It was sunset, and I paused for a little to look about me and to decide which way to turn my steps. I was still debating on this subject when I was joined by this other calender, who stopped to greet me. "You, like me, appear to be a stranger," I said. He replied that I was right, and before he could say more, the third calender came up. He also was newly arrived in Baghdad, and being brothers in misfortune, we resolved to cast in our lots together, and to share whatever fate might have in store. By this time it had grown late, and we did not know where to spend the night. But our lucky star having guided us to this door, we took the liberty of knocking and of asking for shelter, which was given to us at once, with the best grace in the world. This, madam, is my story. "I am satisfied," replied Zubaydah. "You can go when you like." The calender, however, begged leave to stay and to hear the histories of his two friends and of the 3 other persons of the company, which he was allowed to do. That wraps up another story. Thank you for the follow, Ray XXXX. XXXXXX. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. A lot of these stories are about being betrayed by someone close to you. I suppose this one was somewhat of an exception. Let's take a break before continuing with the second story. I really do need to Google the pronunciation of some of the words from the previous story. I'm sorry about that. I probably made many mistakes. English is not my first language, so if you spot any mistakes, please feel free to let me know. I would appreciate it very much. but you didn't notice anything out of place. That's good, I suppose. I actually don't know what a calendar is. Time to Google. A machine in which cloth or paper is pressed by rollers to glaze or smooth it. That does not sound right. Okay, I guess I can search it up later, because Google Dictionary seems to be unable to provide me with a definition that makes sense in context of this story. Sepulchre. A small room or monument cut in rock or built of stone in which a dead person is laid or buried. I see. Sepulchre. Right. I quite like the sound of this thingy. It is actually a tool, if I could call it a tool, where so it's made of a metal sheet which is bent over in the middle in 180 degrees, and in using this bent, or rather folded metal sheet, you clip it to your notebook or whatever, and on this sheet there are two hoops which seem to be made of some sort of spring, as you can hear, and you're supposed to put your pens and pencils within these hoops. Then you can carry around your pens, your two favourite pens, along with your favourite notebook, very conveniently. This is what this thing is. It sounds nice, very crunchy. I've put on both my earbuds to listen to this. Beautiful. A member of a mendicant order of dervishes in Turkey and Persia is a calendar, it seems. Oh, I see. More words that I don't know. Is it something like monk? A kind of monk or something? Well, that was a nice little break. Now, let us continue with the story of the second calendar. Oh, you think so? Yeah, that would make sense, right? Some kind of monk. The story of the second calendar, son of a king. Madam, said the young man, addressing Zubaydah, if you wish to know how I lost my right eye, I shall have to tell you the story of my whole life. I was scarcely more than a baby when the king, my father, finding me unusually quick and clever for my age, turned his thoughts to my education. I was taught first to read and write, and then to learn the Quran, which is the basis of holy religion, and the better to understand it, I read with my tutors, the blessed commentators on its teaching, and committed to memory all the traditions respecting the Prophet, which have been gathered from the mouth of those who were his friends. I also learnt history, and was instructed in poetry, versification, geography, chronology, and in all the outdoor exercises in which every prince should excel. But what I liked best of all was writing Arabic characters, and in this I soon surpassed my masters, and gained a reputation in this branch of knowledge that reached as far as India itself. Now, the Sultan of the Indies, curious to see a young prince with such strange tastes, sent an ambassador to my father, laden with rich presents, and a warm invitation to visit his court. My father, who was deeply anxious to secure the friendship of so powerful a monarch, and held besides that a little travel could greatly improve my manners and open my mind, accepted gladly, and in a short time I had set out for India with the ambassador, attended only by a small suite on account of the length of the journey and the badness of the roads. However, as was my duty, I took with me 10 camels laden with rich presents for the Sultan. We had been travelling for about a month, when one day we saw a cloud of dust moving swiftly towards us, and as soon as it came near, we found that the dust concealed a band of 50 robbers. Our men barely numbered half, and as we were also hampered by the camels, there was no use in fighting, so we tried to overawe them by informing them who we were, and whither we were going. The robbers, however, only laughed and declared that was none of their business, and, without more words, attacked us brutally. I defended myself to the last, wounded though I was, but at length, seeing that resistance was hopeless, and that the ambassador and all our followers were made prisoners, I put spurs to my horse and rode away as fast as I could, till the poor beast fell dead from a wound in his side. I managed to jump off without any injury, and looked about to see if I was pursued, but for the moment I was safe, for, as I imagined, the robbers were all engaged in quarrelling over their booty. I found myself in a country that was quite new to me, and dared not return to the main road, lest I should again fall into the hands of the robbers. Luckily, my wound was only a slight one, and, after binding it up as well as I could, I walked on for the rest of the day, till I reached a cave at the foot of a mountain, where I passed the night in peace, making my supper of some fruits I had gathered on the way. I wandered about for a whole month without knowing where I was going, till at length I found myself on the outskirts of a beautiful city, watered by winding streams, which enjoyed an eternal spring. My delight at the prospect of mixing once more with human beings was somewhat damped at the thought of the miserable object I must seem. My face and hands had been burned nearly black, my clothes were all in rags, and my shoes were in such a state that I had been forced to abandon them altogether. I entered the town and stopped at a tailor's shop to inquire where I was. The man saw I was better than my condition, and begged me to sit down, and in return I told him my whole story. The tailor listened with attention, but his reply, instead of giving me consolation, only increased my trouble. "Beware," he said, "of telling anyone what you have told me, for the prince who governs the kingdom is your father's greatest enemy, and he will be rejoiced to find you in his power." I thanked the tailor for his counsel, and said I would do whatever he advised. Then, being very hungry, I gladly ate of the food he put before me, and accepted his offer of lodging in his house. In a few days I had quite recovered from the hardships I had undergone, and then the tailor, knowing that it was the custom for the princes of our religion to learn a trade or profession so as to provide for themselves in times of ill fortune, inquired if there was anything I could do for my living. I replied that I had been educated as a grammarian and a poet, but that my great gift was writing. "All that is of no use here," said the tailor. "Take my advice. Put on a short coat, and, as you seem hardy and strong, go into the woods and cut firewood, which you will sell in the streets. By this means you will earn your living, and be able to wait till better times come. The hatchet and the cord shall be my present." This counsel was very distasteful to me, but I thought I could not do otherwise than adopt it. So the next morning I set out with a company of poor woodcutters, to whom the tailor had introduced me. Even on the first day I cut enough wood to sell for a tolerable sum, and very soon I became more expert, and had made enough money to repay the tailor all he had lent me. I had been a woodcutter for more than a year, when one day I wandered further into the forest than I had ever done before, and reached a delicious green glade, where I began to cut wood. I was hacking at the root of a tree, when I beheld an iron ring fastened to a trapdoor of the same metal. I soon cleared away the earth, and, pulling up the door, found a staircase, which I hastily made up my mind to go down, carrying my hatchet with me by way of protection. When I reached the bottom, I discovered that I was in a huge palace, as brilliantly lighted as any palace above ground that I had ever seen, with a long gallery supported by pillars of jasper, ornamented with capitals of gold. Down this gallery a lady came to meet me, of such beauty that I forgot everything else, and thought only of her. To save her all the trouble possible, I hastened towards her and bowed low. "Who are you? Who are you?" she said. "A man or a genius?" "A man, madam," I replied. "I have nothing to do with genii." "By what accident do you come here?" she asked again with a sigh. "I have been in this place now for 25 years, and you are the first man who has visited me." Emboldened by her beauty and gentleness, I ventured to reply, "Before, madam, I answer your question, allow me to say how grateful I am for this meeting, which is not only a consolation to me in my own heavy sorrow, but may perhaps enable me to render your lot happier." And then I told her who I was, and how I had come there. "Alas, Prince," she said with a deeper sigh than before, "you have guessed rightly in supposing me an unwilling prisoner in this gorgeous place. I am the daughter of the King of the Ebony Isle, of whose fame you surely must have heard. At my father's desire, I was married to a prince who was my own cousin, but on my very wedding day, I was snatched up by a genius and brought here in a faint. For a long while I did nothing but weep, and would not suffer the genius to come near me. But time teaches us submission, and I have now got accustomed to his presence, and if clothes and jewels could content me, I have them in plenty. Every 10th day for 25 years I have received a visit from him, but in case I should need his help at any other time, I have only to touch a talisman that stands at the entrance of my chamber. It wants still 5 days to his next visit, and I hope that during that time you will do me the honour to be my guest." I was too much dazzled by her beauty to dream of refusing her offer, and accordingly the princess had me conducted to the bath, and a rich dress befitting my rank was provided for me. Then a feast of the most delicate dishes was served in a room hung with embroidered Indian fabrics. Next day, when we were at dinner, I could maintain my patience no longer, and implored the princess to break her bonds and return with me to the world which was lighted by the sun. "What you ask is impossible," she answered, "but stay here with me instead, and we can be happy, and all you will have to do is to betake yourself to the forest every 10th day, when I am expecting my master the genius, He is very jealous, as you know, and will not suffer a man to come near me. Princess, I replied, I see it is only fear of the genius that makes you act like this. For myself, I dread him so little that I mean to break his talisman in pieces. Awful though you think him, he shall feel the weight of my arm, and I herewith take a solemn vow to stamp out the whole race. The princess, who realized the consequences of such audacity, entreated me not to touch the talisman. If you do, it will be the ruin of both of us, said she. I know genii much better than you. But the wine I had drunk had confused my brain. I gave one kick to the talisman, and it fell into 1,000 pieces. Hardly had my foot touched the talisman when the air became as dark as night. A fearful noise was heard, and the palace shook to its very foundations. In an instant I was sobered, and understood what I had done. Princess, I cried, what is happening? Alas, she exclaimed, forgetting all her own terrors in anxiety for me, fly, or you are lost. I followed her advice and dashed up the staircase, leaving my hatchet behind me. But I was too late. The palace opened, and the genius appeared, who, turning angrily to the princess, asked indignantly, What is the matter that you have sent for me like this? A pain in my heart, she replied hastily, obliged me to seek the aid of this little bottle. Feeling faint, I slipped and fell against the talisman, which broke. That is really all. You are an impudent liar, cried the genius. How did this hatchet and those shoes get here? I never saw them before, she answered, and you came in such a hurry that you may have picked them up on the road without knowing it. To this the genius only replied by insults and blows. I could hear the shrieks and groans of the princess, and, having by this time taken off my rich garments and put on those in which I had arrived the previous day, I lifted the trap, found myself once more in the forest, and returned to my friend the tailor with a light load of wood and a heart full of shame and sorrow. The tailor, who had been uneasy at my long absence, was delighted to see me, but I kept silent about my adventure, and as soon as possible retired to my room to lament in secret over my folly. While I was thus indulging my grief, my host entered and said, There is an old man downstairs who has brought your hatchet and slippers, which he picked up on the road, and now restores to you, as he found out from one of your comrades where you lived. You had better come down and speak to him yourself. At this speech, I changed colour, and my legs trembled under me. The tailor noticed my confusion, and was just going to inquire the reason when the door of the room opened, and the old man appeared, carrying with him my hatchet and shoes. I am a genius, he said, the son of the daughter of Iblis, prince of the genii. Is not this hatchet yours, and these shoes? Without waiting for an answer, which indeed I could hardly have given him, so great was my fright, he seized hold of me, and darted up into the air with the quickness of lightning, and then with equal swiftness dropped down towards the earth. When he touched the ground, he rapped it with his foot. It opened, and we found ourselves in the enchanted palace, in the presence of the beautiful princess of the Ebony Isle. But how different she looked from what she was when I had last seen her, for she was lying stretched on the ground covered with blood and weeping bitterly. "Traitress," cried the genius, "is not this man your lover?" She lifted up her eyes slowly and looked sadly at me. "I never saw him before," she answered slowly. "I do not know who he is." "What?" exclaimed the genius. "You owe all your sufferings to him, and yet you dare to say he is a stranger to you." "But if he really is a stranger to me," she replied, "why should I tell a lie and cause his death?" "Very well," said the genius, drawing his sword. "Take this and cut off his head." "Alas," answered the princess, "I am too weak even to hold the sabre. And supposing that I had the strength, why should I put an innocent man to death?" "You condemn yourself by your refusal," said the genius. Then turning to me, he added, "And you, do you not know her?" "How should I?" I replied, resolved to imitate the princess in her fidelity. "How should I when I never saw her before?" "Cut her head off, then, if she is a stranger to you, and I shall believe you are speaking the truth, and will set you at liberty." "Certainly," I answered, taking the sabre in my hands, and making a sign to the princess to fear nothing, as it was my own life that I was about to sacrifice, and not hers. But the look of gratitude she gave me shook my courage, and I flung the sabre to the earth. "I should not deserve to live," I said to the genius, "if I was such a coward as to slay a lady who is not only unknown to me, but who is, at this moment, half dead herself. Do with me as you will. I am in your power, but I refuse to obey your cruel command." "I see," said the genius, "that you have both made up your minds to brave me, but I will give you a sample of what you may expect." So saying, with one sweep of his sabre, he cut off a hand of the princess, who was just able to lift the other to wave me an eternal farewell. Then I lost consciousness for several minutes. When I came to myself, I implored the genius to keep me no longer in this state of suspense, but to lose no time in putting an end to my sufferings. The genius, however, paid no attention to my prayers, but said sternly, "That is the way in which a genius treats the woman who has betrayed him. If I choose, I could kill you also, but I will be merciful and content myself with changing you into a dog, an ass, a lion, or a bird, whichever you prefer." I caught eagerly at these words, as giving me a faint hope of softening his wrath. "O genius," I cried, "as you wish to spare my life, be generous and spare it altogether. Grant my prayer and pardon my crime, as the best man in the whole world forgave his neighbour who was eaten up with envy of him." Contrary to my hopes, the genius seemed interested in my words, and said he would like to hear the story of the two neighbours and as I think, madam, it may please you, I will tell it to you also. Thank you for the follows, Shirley23333, and thank you too for the follow, Luciano_018. Thank you very much for checking out my stream. I hope you all are having a cozy and nice, relaxing experience. Before I continue, I need to get some water as I have finished all that I had in my mug. Please allow me a moment. I am back. I'm very happy to hear that you're having a very cozy time at Tavernier. I should wrap off this stream in around 15 minutes or so. So we're gonna take a short break now and hopefully finish off the second calendar story very soon. In the meantime, while we are enjoying this short intermission, I hope I may please you with the sound of my hairbrush. I have been considering whether to include short pieces of music in these intermissions, or perhaps just one slightly longer classical music intermission in between, like in the middle of a longer stream. I suppose that would be nice for perhaps like streams that take up to 3-4 hours, to have a bit of a music break in the middle. I wonder if you would enjoy the sound of mechanical pencil leads. I have a little box of them right here. Very convenient. Alright, we have around 10 minutes left of stream time, so let us finish off the last part of this sub-story. Hopefully, if not, then at least this section. Perhaps I should leave out the ending before the end of this stream, just to leave you all in suspense. If there's one thing that I should have learnt from this collection of short stories, it must be this. Let me tell you my story, but also a story that I told in my story. Very meta, isn't it? Recursion always hurts my brain. Let us begin. The story of the envious man and of him who was envied. In a town of moderate size, 2 men lived in neighbouring houses, but they had not been there very long before one man took such a hatred of the other and envied him so bitterly that the poor man determined to find another home, hoping that when they no longer met every day his enemy would forget all about him. So he sold his house and the little furniture it contained, and moved into the capital of the country, which was luckily at no great distance. About half a mile from this city, he bought a nice little place with a large garden and a fair-sized court, in the centre of which stood an old well. In order to live a quieter life, the good man put on the robe of a dervish and divided his house into a quantity of small cells, where he soon established a number of other dervishes. The fame of his virtue gradually spread abroad, and many people, including several of the highest quality, came to visit him and ask his prayers. Of course, it was not long before his reputation reached the ears of the man who envied him, and this wicked wretch resolved never to rest till he had in some way worked ill to the dervish whom he hated. So he left his house and his business to look after themselves, and betook himself to the new dervish monastery, where he was welcomed by the founder with all the warmth imaginable. The excuse he gave for his appearance was that he had come to consult the chief of the dervishes on a private matter of great importance. "What I have to say must not be overheard," he whispered. "Command, I beg of you, that your dervishes retire into their cells, as night is approaching, and meet me in the court." The dervish did as he was asked without delay, and directly they were alone together, the envious man began to tell a long story, edging as they walked to and fro, always nearer to the well. And when they were quite close, he seized the dervish and dropped him in. He then ran off triumphantly, without having been seen by anyone, and congratulating himself that the object of his hatred was dead and would trouble him no more. But in this he was mistaken. The old well had long been inhabited, unknown to me human beings, by a set of fairies and genii, who caught the dervish as he fell, so that he received no hurt. The dervish himself could see nothing, but he took for granted that something strange had happened, or he must certainly have been dashed against the side of the well and been killed. He lay quite still, and in a moment he heard a voice saying, "Can you guess whom this man is that we have saved from death?" "No," replied several other voices. And the first speaker answered, "I will tell you. This man, from pure goodness of heart, forsook the town where he lived and came to dwell here, in the hope of curing one of his neighbours of the envy he felt towards him. But his character soon won him the esteem of all, and the envious man's hatred grew, till he came here with the deliberate intention of causing him death. And this he would have done, without our help, the very day before the Sultan has arranged to visit this holy dervish, and to entreat his prayers for the princess his daughter. But what is the matter with the princess, that she needs the dervish's prayers? Asked another voice. She has fallen into the power of the genius Maimoun, the son of Dimdim, replied the first voice. But it would be quite simple for this holy chief of the dervishes to cure her if he only knew. In his convent there is a black cat which has a tiny white tip to its tail. Now, to cure the princess, the dervish must pull out 7 of these white hairs, burn 3, and with their smoke perfume the head of the princess. This will deliver her so completely that Maimoun, the son of Dimdim, will never dare to approach her again. The fairies and genii ceased talking, but the dervish did not forget a word of all they had said, and when morning came, he perceived a place in the side of the well which was broken, and where he could easily climb out. The dervishes, who could not imagine what had become of him, were enchanted at his reappearance. He told them of the attempt on his life made by his guest of the previous day, and then retired into his cell. He was soon joined here by the black cat of which the voice had spoken, who came as usual to say good morning to his master. He took him on his knee and seized the opportunity to pull 7 white hairs out of his tail and put them on one side till they were needed. The sun had not long risen before the Sultan, who was anxious to leave nothing undone that might deliver the princess, arrived with a large suite at the gate of the monastery, and was received by the dervishes with profound respect. The Sultan lost no time in declaring the object of his visit, and, leading the chief of the dervishes aside, he said to him, "Noble Shaykh, you have guessed perhaps what I have come to ask you." "Yes, sire," answered the dervish. "If I am not mistaken, it is the illness of the princess which has procured me this honour." "You are right," returned the Sultan, "and you will give me fresh life if you can, by your prayers, deliver my daughter from this strange malady that has taken possession of her. Let your highness command her to come here, and I will see what I can do." The Sultan, full of hope, sent orders at once that the princess was to set out as soon as possible, accompanied by her usual staff of attendants. When she arrived, she was so thickly veiled that the dervish could not see her face, but he desired a brazier to be held over her head, and laid the 7 hairs on the burning coals. The instant they were consumed, terrific cries were heard, but no one could tell from whom they proceeded. Only the dervish guessed that they were uttered by Maimoun, the son of Dimdim, who felt the princess escaping him. All this time she had seemed unconscious of what she was doing, but now she raised her hand to her veil and uncovered her face. "Where am I?" she said in a bewildered manner, "and how did I get here?" The Sultan was so delighted to hear these words that he not only embraced his daughter, but kissed the hand of the dervish. Then, turning to his attendants who stood round, he said to them, "What reward shall I give to the man who has restored me my daughter?" They all replied with one accord that he deserved the hand of the princess. "That is my own opinion," said he, "and from this moment I declare him to be my son-in-law." Shortly after these events, the Grand Vizier died, and his post was given to the dervish. But he did not hold it for long, for the Sultan fell a victim to an attack of illness, and as he had no sons, the soldiers and priests declared the dervish heir to the throne, to the great joy of all the people. One day, when the dervish, who had now become sultan, was making a royal progress with his court, he received the envious man standing in the crowd. He made a sign to one of his viziers and whispered in his ear, "Fetch me that man who is standing out there, but take great care not to frighten him." The vizier obeyed, and when the envious man was brought before the Sultan, the monarch said to him, "My friend, I am delighted to see you again." Then, turning to an officer, he added, "Give him 1,000 pieces of gold out of my treasury, and 20 wagon loads of merchandise out of my private stores, and let an escort of soldiers accompany him home." He then took leave of the envious man and went on his way. Now, when I had ended my story, I proceeded to show the genius how to apply it to himself. "O genius," I said, "you see that this Sultan was not content with merely forgiving the envious man for the attempt on his life. He heaped rewards and riches upon him. But the genius had made up his mind, and could not be softened. 'Do not imagine that you are going to escape so easily,' he said. 'All I can do is to give you bare life. You will have to learn what happens to people who interfere with me.' As he spoke, he seized me violently by the arm. The roof of the palace opened to make way for us, and we mounted up so high into the air that the earth looked like a little cloud. Then, as before, he came down with the swiftness of lightning, and we touched the ground on a mountain top. Then he stooped and gathered a handful of earth, and murmured some words over it, after which he threw the earth in my face, saying as he did so, 'Quit the form of a man, and assume that of a monkey.' This done, he vanished, and I was in the likeness of an ape, and in a country I had never seen before. However, there was no use in stopping where I was, so I came down the mountain and found myself in a flat plain which was bounded by the sea. I travelled towards it, and was pleased to see a vessel moored about 1/2 a mile from shore. There were no waves, so I broke off the branch of a tree, and, dragging it down to the water's edge, sat across it, while using 2 sticks for oars, I rowed myself towards the ship. The deck was full of people, who watched my progress with interest, but when I seized a rope and swung myself on board, I found that I had only escaped death at the hands of the genius to perish by those of the sailors, lest I should bring ill luck to the vessel and the merchants. "Throw him into the sea," cried one. "Knock him on the head with a hammer," exclaimed the other. "Let me shoot him with an arrow," said a third. And certainly somebody would have had his way if I had not flung myself at the captain's feet and grasped tight hold of his dress. He appeared touched by my action and patted my head, and declared that he would take me under his protection, and that no one should do me any harm. At the end of about 50 days, we cast anchor before a large town, and the ship was immediately surrounded by a multitude of small boats filled with people who had come either to meet their friends or from simple curiosity. Among others, one boat contained several officials who asked to see the merchants on board, and informed them that they had been sent by the Sultan in token of welcome, and to beg them each to write a few lines on a roll of paper. In order to explain the strange request, continued the officers, it is necessary that you should know that the Grand Vizier, lately dead, was celebrated for his beautiful handwriting, and the Sultan is anxious to find a similar talent in his successor. Hitherto the search has been a failure, but His Highness has not yet given up hope. One after the other, the merchants set down a few lines upon the roll, and when they had all finished, I came forward and snatched the paper from the man who held it. At first they all thought I was going to throw it into the sea, but they were quieted when they saw I held it with great care, and great was their surprise when I made signs that I too wished to write something. "Let him do it if he wants to," said the captain. "If he only makes a mess of the paper, you may be sure I will punish him for it. But if, as I hope, he really can write, for he is the cleverest monkey I ever saw, I will adopt him as my son. The one I lost had not nearly so much sense." No more was said, and I took the pen and wrote the 6 sorts of writing in use among the Arabs, and each sort contained an original verse or couplet in praise of the Sultan. And not only did my handwriting completely eclipse that of the merchants, but it is hardly too much to say that none so beautiful had ever before been seen in that country. When I had ended, the officials took the roll and returned to the Sultan. As soon as the monarch saw my writing, he did not so much as look at the samples of the merchants, but desired his officials to take the finest and most richly caparisoned horse in his stables, together with the most magnificent dress they could procure, and to put it on the person who had written those lines, and bring him to court. The officials began to laugh when they heard the Sultan's command, but as soon as they could speak, they said, "Deign, your Highness, to excuse our mirth, but those lines were not written by a man, but by a monkey." "A monkey?" exclaimed the Sultan. "Yes, sire," answered the officials. "They were written by a monkey in our presence." "Then bring me the monkey," he replied, "as fast as you can." The Sultan's officials returned to the ship and showed the royal order to the captain. "He is the master," said the good man, and desired that I should be sent for. Then they put on me the gorgeous robe and rode me to land, where I placed on the horse and led to the palace. Here the Sultan was awaiting me in great state, surrounded by his court. All the way along the streets I had been the object of curiosity to a vast crowd which had filled every doorway and every window, and it was amidst their shouts and cheers that I was ushered into the presence of the Sultan. I approached the throne on which he was seated and made him 3 low bows, then prostrated myself at his feet to the surprise of everyone, who could not understand how it was possible that a monkey should be able to distinguish a sultan from other people, and to pay him the respect due to his rank. However, excepting the usual speech, I omitted none of the common forms attending a royal audience. When it was over, the Sultan dismissed all the court, keeping with him only the chief of the eunuchs and a little slave. He then passed into another room and ordered food to be brought, making signs to me to sit at table with him and eat. I rose from my seat, kissed the ground, and took my place at the table, eating, as you may suppose, with care and in moderation. Before the dishes were removed, I made signs that writing materials, which stood in one corner of the room, should be laid in front of me. I then took a page and wrote on it some verses in praise of the Sultan, who was speechless with astonishment. But when I did the same thing on a glass from which I had drunk, he murmured to himself, "Why, a man who could do as much would be cleverer than any other man, and this is only a monkey." Supper being over, chessmen were brought, and the Sultan signed to me to know if I would play with him. I kissed the ground and lay my hand on my head to show that I was ready to show myself worthy of the honour. He beat me the first game, but I won the second and third, and seeing that this did not quite please, I dashed off a verse by way of consolation. The Sultan was so enchanted with all the talents of which I had given proof that he wished me to exhibit some of them to other people. So, turning to the chief of the eunuchs, he said, "Go and beg my daughter, Queen of Beauty, to come here. I will show her something she has never seen before." The chief of the eunuchs bowed and left the room, ushering in a few moments later the princess, Queen of Beauty. Her face was uncovered, but the moment she set foot in the room, she threw her veil over her head. "Sire," she said to her father, "what can you be thinking of to summon me like this into the presence of a man?" "I do not understand you," replied the Sultan. "There is nobody here but the eunuch, who is your own servant, the little slave, and myself. Yet you cover yourself with your veil and reproach me for having sent for you as if I had committed a crime." "Sire," answered the princess, "I am right and you are wrong. This monkey is really no monkey at all, but a young prince who has been turned into a monkey by the wicked spells of a genius, son of the daughter of Iblis." As will be imagined, these words took the Sultan by surprise, and he looked at me to see how I should take the statement of the princess. As I was unable to speak, I placed my hand on my head to show that it was true. "But how do you know this, my daughter?" asked he. "Sire," replied Queen of Beauty, "the old lady who took care of me in my childhood was an accomplished magician, and she taught me 70 rules of her art, by means of which I could, in the twinkling of an eye, transplant your capital into the middle of the ocean. Her art likewise teaches me to recognize at first sight all persons who are enchanted, and tells me by whom the spell was wrought." "My daughter," said the Sultan, "I really had no idea you were so clever." "Sire," replied the princess, "there are many out-of-the-way things it is as well to know, but one should never boast of them." "Well," asked the Sultan, "can you tell me what must be done to disenchant the young prince?" "Certainly, and I can do it." "Then restore him to his proper shape," cried the Sultan. "You could give me no greater pleasure, for I wish to make him my Grand Vizier, and to give him to you for your husband." "As your highness pleases," replied the princess. Queen of Beauty rose and went to her chamber, from which she fetched a knife with some Hebrew words engraven on the blade. She then desired the Sultan, the chief of the eunuchs, the little slave, and myself, to descend into a secret court of the palace, and placed us beneath a gallery which ran all round, she herself standing in the centre of the court. Here she traced a large circle, and in it wrote several words in Arab characters. When the circle and the writing were finished, she stood in the middle of it and repeated some verses from the Quran. Slowly the air grew dark, and we felt as if the earth was about to crumble away, and our fright was by no means diminished at seeing the genius, son of the daughter of Iblis, suddenly appear under the form of a colossal lion. "Dog," cried the princess when she first caught sight of him, "you think to strike terror into me by daring to present yourself before me in this hideous shape." "And you," retorted the lion, "have not feared to break our treaty that engaged solemnly we should never interfere with each other." "Accursed genius!" exclaimed the princess. "It is you by whom that treaty was first broken." "I will teach you how to give me so much trouble," said the lion, and, opening his huge mouth, he advanced to swallow her. But the princess expected something of the sort and was on her guard. She bounded on one side and, seizing one of the hairs of his mane, repeated 2 or 3 words over it. In an instant it became a sword, and with a sharp blow she cut the lion's body into 2 pieces. These pieces vanished, no one knew where, and only the lion's head remained, which was at once changed into a scorpion. Quick as thought, the princess assumed the form of a serpent and gave battle to the scorpion, who, finding he was getting the worst of it, turned himself into an eagle and took flight. But in a moment the serpent had become an eagle more powerful still, who soared up in the air and after him, and then we lost sight of them both. We all remained where we were, quaking with anxiety, when the ground opened in front of us, and a black and white cat leapt out, its hair standing on end and meowing frightfully. At its heels was a wolf, who had almost seized it when the cat changed itself into a worm and, piercing the skin of a pomegranate which had tumbled from a tree, hid itself in the fruit. The pomegranate swelled till it grew as large as a pumpkin and raised itself onto the roof of the gallery, from which it fell into the court and was broken into pieces. While this was taking place, the wolf, who had transformed himself into a cock, began to swallow the seed of the pomegranate as fast as he could. When all were gone, he flew towards us, flapping his wings as if to ask if we saw any more, when suddenly his eye fell on one which lay on the bank of the little canal that flowed through the court. He hastened towards it, but before he could touch it, the seed rolled into the canal and became a fish. The cock flung himself in after the fish and took the shape of a pike, and for 2 hours they chased each other up and down under the water, uttering horrible cries. But we could see nothing. At length they rose from the water in their proper forms, but darting such flames of fire from their mouths that we dreaded lest the palace should catch fire. Soon, however, we had much greater cause for alarm, as the genius, having shaken off the princess, flew towards us. Our fate would have been sealed if the princess, seeing our danger, had not attracted the attention of the genius to herself. As it was, the sultan's beard was singed and his face scorched. The chief of the eunuchs was burned to a cinder, while a spark deprived me of the sight of one eye. Both I and the sultan had given up all hope of a rescue, when there was a shout of "Victory! Victory!" from the princess, and the genius lay at her feet, a great heap of ashes. Exhausted though she was, the princess at once ordered the little slave, who alone was uninjured, to bring her a cup of water, which she took in her hand. First, repeating some magic words over it, she dashed it into my face, saying, "If you are only a monkey by enchantment, resume the form of the man you were before." In an instant I stood before her, the same man I had formerly been, though having lost the sight of one eye. I was about to fall on my knees and thank the princess, but she did not give me time. Turning to the sultan, her father, she said, "Sire, I have gained the battle, but it has cost me dear. The fire has penetrated to my heart, and I have only a few moments to live." This would not have happened if I had only noticed the last pomegranate seed and eaten it like the rest. It was the last struggle of the genius, and up to that time I was quite safe. But having let this chance slip, I was forced to resort to fire, and in spite of all his experience, I showed the genius that I knew more than he did. He is dead and in ashes, but my own death is approaching fast. "My daughter," cried the sultan, "how sad is my condition! I am only surprised I am alive at all. The eunuch is consumed by the flames, and the prince whom you have delivered has lost the sight of one eye." He could say no more, for sobs choked his voice, and we all wept together. Suddenly the princess shrieked, "I burn, I burn," and death came to free her from her torments. I have no words, madam, to tell you of my feelings at this terrible sight. I would rather have remained a monkey all my life than let my benefactress perish in this shocking manner. As for the Sultan, he was quite inconsolable, and his subjects, who had dearly loved the princess, shared his grief. For 7 days the whole nation mourned, and then the ashes of the princess were buried with great pomp, and a superb tomb was raised over her. As soon as the Sultan recovered from the severe illness which had seized him after the death of the princess, he sent for me and plainly, though politely, informed me that my presence would always remind him of his loss, and he begged that I would instantly quit his kingdom, and, on pain of death, never return to it. I was of course bound to obey, and not knowing what was to become of me, I shaved my beard and eyebrows, and put on the dress of a calender. After wandering aimlessly through several countries, I resolved to come to Baghdad and request an audience of the commander of the faithful. And that, madam, is my story. The other calender then told his story. Well, that was a very long and chaotic story. Oh, hello Arklados, mud muddly mud. I hope you're enjoying the stream. Shapeshift battle. Yeah, it really was all over the place. It reminds me of like some of my more chaotic dreams. This story has like, 3 climaxes? Oh boy. Yes, it definitely was interesting. I got lost after he turned into a monkey. Well, sure, yes, a whole lot of stuff happened after he got turned into a monkey. Oh boy, that is a chaotic one. Well, I'm afraid I will have to end my stream here. Let me check my schedule real quick to let you know when I will stream again. Okay. I believe I shall continue this story next Saturday, same time next Saturday, 6 AM Greenwich Mean Time. That should be the 16th of April. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Jestilins. Thank you everyone, and thank you to all the new followers, and I hope to see you all next week. Here's a little reminder that my socials are under my About section on the top right hand corner. If you like, you can check them out. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you, Neurocracy. Have a good day, and I'll see you all next week. Bye bye.